Right now, something quiet is happening to the global food system. It is not a drought. It is not a disease wiping out crops. It is not a flood washing away farmland. It is a 33-kilometer strip of water in the Middle East, a waterway called the Strait of Hormuz, and its disruption is doing something that most people in America and Europe have not yet connected to their daily lives. Gas prices are climbing. A loaf of bread in the UK quietly crossed £4. A corn farmer in Iowa opened a fertilizer bill that made him sit down on the ground. And the FAO, the United Nations Food Agency, issued a statement using one word the world had not heard in a very long time. Today, I want to show you exactly why a shipping lane most people cannot find on a map is now threatening grocery bills, farm incomes, and the broader economy across the Western world, in ways that go far deeper than anyone is currently admitting. Look at this map. The Strait of Hormuz is roughly 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and through this gap flows 20% of all the oil on Earth, 20% of all liquefied natural gas, and between 20 and 45% of all the fertilizer inputs that the world's farmers need to grow food before the current disruption. Roughly 130 ships pass through this strait every single day. By March 2026, that number collapsed to just 6. That is a 95% shutdown of one of the most critical arteries in the global economy. And here is the number that should make every American, every European, every person in the Western world sit up straight. Urea spot prices at the U.S. Gulf Coast approached $700 per metric ton, up over 30% in a matter of weeks, and dealers in major importing markets began limiting sales. You do not know what urea is? That is okay. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why that number is the most dangerous number in the world right now. Here is the painful irony at the center of this story. The stated goal of disrupting Iran was, in part, to protect energy security, to keep oil markets stable, but the moment the strait closed, the opposite happened. Gas prices in the United States rose $1.16 a gallon within weeks. Prices were expected to hit $5 a gallon if the strait remained closed through mid-April. Jet fuel in North America spiked 95%. American Airlines started adding surcharges on checked baggage because their fuel bill had nearly doubled. Shipping services, the U.S. Postal Service, Amazon, FedEx, all implemented fuel surcharges. Now, the gas prices? That is the visible part of the iceberg. The part underwater is the one that will haunt the West for years. I want to tell you about a man named Ben Vig. Ben is a farmer and former state representative from North Dakota. He grows wheat and corn. In March 2026, he said something that stopped me cold. The price of dry urea in January to February was $560 per ton. At the end of March, it was $770 per ton. That is a 37% spike in 6 weeks. And here is why that matters. Fertilizers like urea make up somewhere between 33% and 45% of operating expenses for major American corn and wheat crops. Think about that. For a corn farmer in Illinois or Iowa, nearly half of everything they spend goes into fertilizer. And that fertilizer just got 40% more expensive overnight, right in the middle of planting season, the worst possible timing. But you might be thinking, America has its own natural gas, shale gas, fracking. Why are American farmers affected? This is the question I had too, and the answer reveals the hidden architecture of modern agriculture that nobody ever explains. Fertilizer is not just about where the gas comes from. It is a globally integrated market. Nearly half of global urea exports come from countries west of the Strait of Hormuz, and they transit through the waterway on their way to countries like the U.S. Even though the U.S. does not typically import ammonia directly from the region, rising ammonia prices still hit American farmers because, like oil, fertilizer is bought and sold on a globally integrated market. So, when Qatar, one of the world's largest urea exporters, declared force majeure on all its contracts and shut down gas liquefaction because tankers could not leave the Gulf, the ripple hit every single market on Earth, including Des Moines, Iowa. Now look at this data. The USDA's prospective plantings report, released on March 31st, 2026, revealed that corn planting intentions dropped to 95.3 million acres, a 3% decline from the previous year, with the sharpest decreases in Illinois and Iowa. Soybean intentions climbed to 84.7 million acres, up 4%. This is American farmers voting with their seed bags. They are quietly abandoning corn, the crop that feeds America and the world, because they can no longer afford to fertilize it. They are pivoting to soybeans, which do not need nitrogen fertilizer, just to survive. One Iowa farmer put it plainly, "Our biggest struggles are our inputs: fertilizer, seed, chemical, parts. There's been so much drastic markup in all of these. I just kind of feel like the farmer is painted into a corner." And this is not just one farmer. A total of 54 agricultural groups wrote to President Trump calling for market relief for America's farmers, saying, as planting season began in earnest across much of the U.S., the closure of the Strait of Hormuz sent fuel and fertilizer prices skyrocketing. 54 agricultural groups writing to the president, begging for relief. If America is hurting, Europe is bleeding, because Europe has two problems simultaneously: energy and food, and they are feeding each other into a spiral. First, the energy problem. The disruption hit Europe particularly hard because the crisis coincided with historically low European gas storage levels, estimated at just 30% capacity following a harsh 2025-2026 winter, causing Dutch TTF gas benchmarks to nearly double to over 60 euros per MWh per hour by mid-March. 30% storage going into a crisis that shut off their primary gas supply. The consequence was immediate. The European Central Bank postponed its planned interest rate reductions, raised its 2026 inflation forecast, and cut GDP growth projections. Germany's yearly growth forecast was slashed to just 0.6%. UK inflation is expected to breach 5% in 2026. 5% UK inflation? In the middle of a cost of living crisis that had barely healed from 2002. But here is where the food angle enters. In the UK, the Food and Drink Federation, which represents 12,000 food and drink manufacturers, revised its food inflation forecast upward, expecting it to reach 9% by the end of the year. It had previously estimated 3%. 9%. Every loaf of bread, every packet of pasta, every carton of milk, going up by almost 10% in a country where people are already struggling. Chemical and steel manufacturers across the UK and EU have already imposed surcharges of up to 30% to offset surging electricity and feedstock costs. And Shell, one of the world's largest energy companies, warned that Europe could face a shortage of fuel as early as April. A fuel shortage in Europe in 2026. Now I want to show you a number that made me reread the page 3 times. Oxford Economics, one of the world's most respected economic research institutions, ran a scenario called the Prolonged Iran War. The premise: what happens if the Strait of Hormuz stays effectively closed for 6 months? Here is what they found. Losing almost 20% of global oil supply leads to shortages and rationing. Global inflation hits 7.7%, close to the 2022 peak. But unlike 2022, when the global economy kept growing through the price shock, the severity of this disruption tips the world into outright contraction. The US and most major advanced economies slide into recession. China's growth falls to 3.4%. Oxford Economics stated directly, the last times the global economy contracted were during the pandemic and the global financial crisis. This would be the worst synchronized downturn in 40 years outside those two events. The worst downturn in 40 years, comparable only to COVID and 2008. And the IMF has already warned that the conflict could slow global economic growth, stoke inflation, and increase the possibility of a worldwide recession. The IMF, the organization that exists to prevent global financial collapse, using the word recession in April 2006. Let me take you back 50 years. In 1973, Arab oil-producing nations placed an embargo on countries aligned with the United States. Oil prices quadrupled. Lines formed at gas stations across America. The Nixon administration introduced fuel rationing. European governments banned Sunday driving. The UK put people on a 3-day workweek to save electricity. Analysts have already warned that the current disruption risks becoming worse than that 1970s oil crisis. Worse, and in 1973, only oil was disrupted. Fertilizer still flowed. Farmers could still plant. The food system, while stressed, did not face an input crisis. This time is different. The war in Ukraine disrupted a breadbasket, a crisis of agricultural outputs. The Hormuz crisis disrupts the industrial inputs that make those breadbaskets possible. Ukraine took wheat off the table. Hormuz is threatening humanity's ability to grow wheat at all. Here is where the story enters its darkest chapter. Even if the strait reopens tomorrow, even if a ceasefire is announced today, the damage to the 22-6 growing season is already locked in. Here is why. To get fertilizer product from around the world, a farmer has to place an order. Once placed, it takes 4 weeks for a cargo ship to travel from one side of the planet to the other. Then 3 to 4 weeks from cargo ship to barge. Then the barge travels up the river to the farm, 2 to 3 months from order to field. And for much of the spring crop, that window has already passed. U.S. farmers in the Corn Belt are being forced to make last-minute decisions that could impact food security and commodity prices for years to come. And surveys show that farmers are already more worried about the 22-7 season than 22-6, fearing that the long tail of this disruption will result in a multi-year supply shortage that current inventories cannot absorb. And here is the doom loop that nobody in the mainstream press is discussing. Less corn planted in 2026, lower corn yields, higher corn prices, higher meat prices. Because corn feeds livestock, higher prices for everything corn touches, which in America is almost everything. Then, in 2027, if fertilizer prices remain elevated, even fewer farmers can afford to plant nitrogen-hungry crops. Yields drop further. Food prices rise more. The FAO put it bluntly. When you push farmers too much, you may bring them into bankruptcy. And then it means there will be a supply problem for a longer period. This is not a temporary spike. This is a structural fracture in the Western food system that will take years to heal, if it heals at all. So here is the question I keep returning to. How did the world's most powerful economies not calculate this? America has a vast intelligence apparatus, but analysts are now calling attention to a gap in what they term industrial intelligence. The analytical rigor needed to foresee strategic blind spots around physical commodities and industrial choke points that underpin the global economy. The planners calculated missile trajectories. They did not calculate what happens when the world's urea supply disappears for 6 weeks. And the result? Global merchandise trade is expected to slow sharply, from 4.7% growth in 2025 to just 1.5 to 2.5% in 2026. UNCTAD warns that 3.4 billion people live in countries already spending more on debt than on health or education. Those people will be the first to go hungry, not because of a drought, not because of a flood, but because modern agriculture was built on a single point of failure, a 33-kilometer waterway, and nobody in any position of power ever treated that as a serious risk until it was too late. Before I leave you completely grim, let me tell you what is actually possible, because this crisis, as real as it is, has also exposed something important. The Western world's food system has a dependency problem, and dependency problems, when they become visible, sometimes get fixed. The first opportunity is domestic fertilizer production. America has abundant natural gas. It simply never built the fertilizer production infrastructure to match. This crisis may finally force that investment. Fertilizer companies like CF Industries are already seeing record revenues. The economic signal is there for new capacity to be built. The second is precision agriculture. If you cannot increase fertilizer supply, you can dramatically reduce how much you waste. Drones, soil sensors, AI-driven application systems. The technology exists. The economic pressure to adopt it has now arrived. Corn Belt farmers are already consulting precision application data to stretch every pound of fertilizer they can still afford. The third, and this is the structural lesson that the entire episode is screaming, is energy diversification. Every country that delayed investment in renewable energy during the cheap oil era is now watching the economics flip in real time. Solar and wind power reduce vulnerability to external supply disruptions in a way that no amount of military spending can replicate. Here is the truth about this moment. A 33-kilometer strip of water, so narrow you could theoretically see from one side to the other on a clear day, has revealed that the most powerful economies on Earth built their entire food systems on a single point of failure. The disruption is hitting American farm incomes, British supermarket shelves, German chemical plants. Every household in the Western world that is about to open a grocery receipt and wonder what happened, the FAO's chief economist said it plainly: the clock is the key. Let us avoid a perfect storm. Be aware of the risks, put the right policies in place, and pursue the diplomatic solutions needed to avert a food crisis we do not need. The clock is ticking. The question is whether the people who make decisions are listening. If you found this useful, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to understand what is happening. Subscribe for more videos like this, because this story is only going to develop further in the months ahead. I will see you in the next one.